In this lecture, we'll talk about the tradition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art or discipline that deals with the use of discourse. That discourse can either be spoken or written to inform or to persuade or to motivate an audience. That audience can be made up of one person. That audience can be made up of multiple people as well. When we deal with proposal writing, we look at the literature, there's not a lot of information about rhetoric, its traditions, and its theories, and I think that's a mistake. Rhetorical tradition provides an invaluable set of constructs, tools, and skills that allow the proposal writer to design, draft, and submit a highly effective proposal. So in this lecture, we'll spend time talking about the rhetorical tradition. Before we do that, perhaps, we should spend some time thinking about what literacy is itself. Walter Ong is a wonderful guide for us in his book Orality and Literacy, The Technologizing of the Word. Ong tells us that literacy impacts the way we think. That is, that there are psychodynamics of literacy and psychodynamics of orality. Let's follow Walter Ong and take each of these in detail. Ong tells us that orally based thought is additive rather than subordinative. Listen to this passage from a very early 17th century version of the Bible, a passage that was written when there was still a massive oral culture present in Europe. Here's the version. In the beginning God created heaven and earth, and the earth was void and empty, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters, and God said, Be light made. And light was made, and God saw the light, and it was good, and he divided the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness night, and there was evening and morning one day. 9 introductory ands in that passage is what you find, and you begin to get the idea that thought is additive in orally based cultures and orally based patterns rather than subordinative. Ong also tells us that orally based thought is aggregative rather than analytic. That is, orally based thought tends to belong to the world of formulas. The literacy-based world, the world we function in, those are often called cliches, aren't they? But to the orally based world, aggregative thought, formulas, or a way to remember something when print does not exist. Orally based thought, Ong tells us, is redundant. It's copious. An oral utterance vanishes. So if something has to be remembered, it has to be said in an orally based culture again and again and again to be remembered. Ong tells us also that orally based thought is conservative and often traditional. In saying something over and over again, it helps reify that something is true. So certain stories, ideas, methods of thought are very traditional because they're repeated time and time again, and these become touchstones and cornerstones of orally based culture. Orally based thought, Ong tells us, is very close to the human life world. It's very interesting that in literacy we always try to achieve a distance, don't we? I want to talk to hundreds and hundreds of people in a document. I want to advocate something in a proposal to an audience I don't know, so I go in a room and close the door. Not true with speech. In orally based cultures, there's an attempt to be close to the human life world, and the distinction in the distance we achieve with the written word is absent in such cultures. As well, its orally based thought is often agonistically toned. By agon, we recall the Greek idea of struggle. And struggle, the idea of an epic battle, the idea of something that was very difficult, helps us remember something. And so agon, the idea of struggle, is important as well to orally based cultures. Very often, Ong tells us, orally based cultures, orally based thought, is empathetic, and it's participatory rather than objectively distanced, and of course that would follow from the other characteristics because of the sense of community that is necessary to convey word to ear, as opposed to the isolation to convey written word to eye. Orally based cultures are very often primarily homeostatic, that is, they exist and function in the present, and orally based thought very often is situational rather than abstract. This idea merits some thought. A.R. Luria wrote a book called Cognitive Development, Its Cultural and Social Foundations, and that book was published in 1976. Luria did work early in the century with illiterate persons in the remoter areas of the Soviet Union. One of the experiments is worth noting. He presented subjects with drawings of 4 objects. 3 belonged to one category and the 4th to another. And illiterate people who we were interviewing were asked to group those that were similar or could be placed in one group and designated by one word. So one series consisted of drawings and objects like a hammer, a saw, a log, a hatchet. And illiterate subjects, those in an orally based culture, consistently thought of the group not in categorical terms, 3 tools and the log's not a tool, the hammer, the saw, the hatchet a tool, the log it's not, and didn't really classify them at all. If you're a workman with tools, you see a log, you think of applying a tool to it, not of keeping the tool away from what was made for it. A 25-year-old literate peasant said, "They're all alike. The saw will saw the log and the hatchet will chop it into small pieces. If one of these has to go, I'd throw out the hatchet. It doesn't do as good a job as the saw." Told that the hammer, saw, and hatchet are all tools, the peasant discounted the class and persists in situational thinking. But even if we have tools, he says, you still need wood, otherwise you can't build anything. Asked why another person had rejected one item in another series of 4, felt that all brought together, that person replied, "Probably that kind of thinking runs in the blood." Walter Ong's work is important to us. It's important in a theoretical sense, but it's important too in a practical sense, because it stresses the differences that exist in a print culture than the existences that exist in an oral culture. It would be very difficult for anyone taking this course to imagine a primarily oral world, but nevertheless, there are residual traits of orality that exists in all situations. Ong's work will help us to understand the closed world of the text and help us to understand ways to brighten or enliven that world, and also help us to understand the world in which we might have to present our ideas not in the written word, but in oral fashion as well. Ong's work, for our purposes, therefore becomes essential. In taking a look at classical rhetoric, we might begin in the 5th century BC. Some of these names will be familiar to you, others will not. Socrates, for example, probably is not a familiar name, but his attention to elegance, to beauty of style, influences us throughout the tradition even today. Certainly Plato, threw poets out of his Republic. He felt that rhetoricians, poets among them, could not be considered a true art, did not rest on universal principles. Aristotle, though, among these early thinkers, is most important to us. His work on logos, the logical, pathos, the empathetic, and ethos, the pursuit of the just, gives us some ideas of the ways that we might persuade. His emphasis on the syllogism, with its concern with major premise, minor premise, and conclusion, is with us today, and certainly syllogistic logic drove some of the most important documents of American democracy, including the Declaration of Independence. Aristotle in his Rhetoric talks about even the process of composing, an invention, arrangement, and style. He had concern for his audience, and always, especially in works like the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle encouraged us to pursue those things that are properly considered the virtuous, the just, and the proper. During the medieval period, St. Augustine becomes very important to us. In his autobiography, he convinces us that narrative becomes an effective means of persuasion, and from St. Augustine we get the rhetorical device as narrative. and began to believe, as we do now, that an important way of convincing is through the autobiographical impulse. In the 16th century, the work of Pita Ramos becomes important. Perhaps that's a name you're not familiar with, but the French scholar was very important. He was a great classifier and a systematizer of knowledge, and he began to get the idea, and promoted the idea, that discovery and arrangement of matter ideas belong to the province of logic, and that rhetoric only was about style and delivery. Well, this is, I think, still with us today. We think our ideas exist separately from the way that we put them down on the page. We know cognitively, of course, that this is incorrect. The way we put down ideas on the page changes us to shape and refine our thinking, but not for Ramos. For Ramos, there was an idea of ideas. Writing came later. Elocution came later. And I think that that idea is still with us today. We might call it the Ramistic dichotomy. It is, for our purposes, problematic, something to get beyond. But what about the scientific style? Certainly we have that in the work of John Wilkins. He was a main agent in the Philosophical Royal Society, and his philosophical transactions from 1665 all the way through 1880 embody some of the stylistic techniques that Wilkins believed in. He liked the utilitarian style. He advocated a plain style that was not ornamented. And that idea of the plain style, the scientific style, remains with us today in professional and technical writing. Let's shift in the 18th century for a moment to these Scottish rhetoricians who had an important place in American colleges. Classical rhetoric in American colleges was, for all intents and purposes, overthrown with the English rule. Why? It was associated with English colleges and with an English way of life. It grounded in a field that was seen as not conducive to the new practical needs of America. These three rhetoricians, Campbell, Blair, and Whately, were the dominant rhetoricians, and their books were dominant in America until more or less the last 3 decades of the 19th century. What were they interested in? Well, they promoted what might be called college common sense realism, a real rebellion against Aristotelian philosophy. Induction is a method for securing truth. Deduction is clear at all but useless. Truth exists apart from the arbitrary nature of language. All these ideas fit very well into the capitalistic impulses of the new colonies, and indeed help build upon the idea that knowledge, ideas, are separate from the language used to convey that language, and that when language is used it must be pure, it must be pristine, and it must be at all costs utilitarian. Adam Sherman Hill's work was enormously influential, and his books were published in edition after edition after edition. Why talk about him? Scholar James Berlin says that he represents, along with others, an idea of current traditional rhetoric. For these rhetoricians, 2 things were important. First of all, persuasion was removed from rhetorical posture, or at least it was called only, as Hill, for example, called it, a useful adjunct. And second, the idea of correctness became very important. Do you remember the drilling you got in grammar school about grammar and mechanics? If you're old enough, as I am, you can even remember diagramming sentences. This idea that mechanical correctness and editing is the most important thing in the writing process really derives from the tradition of current traditional rhetoric in the 19th century. I'd like to say that it ends, but as I think we all know, it still persists today. Where are we now in the 20th century as we begin the 21st century? Kenneth Burke, James Canavery, Linda Flower, and Jacques Derrida all prove very important. Kenneth Burke, and we'll refer to him time and again, was a wonderful and creative thinker. Among his most significant ideas for us is the idea of the pentad, that there are action, agent, agency, scene, and purpose in any discourse situation, and the more we can know about the relationships of these 5 elements of discourse, Burke calls them ratios, the more we can know about the setting of a discourse and what works well or does not work in any sort of interchange. James Canavery let us see that discourse has an aim. He's a structuralist, and he talked about reality and rhetoric as being in parts that are expressive, such as a journal or diary, referential rhetoric, scientific forms fall in here, perhaps proposal writing, literary, the short story, narrative, TV, movies, jokes, and persuasive. But again, Canavy operates in the tradition that is Rhemistic, a great classifier of knowledge, certainly, but begins to pull us sometimes away from the idea that the persuasive and the referential can be identical. And certainly that becomes very true in our idea of proposal writing. Linda Flower, a Carnegie Mellon researcher, continues to help us see the idea of the social context in which literacy emerges and the importance of community of writers in the writing process itself. Jacques Derrida helped us learn more about contingency. A post-structuralist, he taught us that the suggestion of the signification of words and those things that are meant by words are not often a one-to-one match. So for Derrida, the idea of the contingency of language becomes very important. And here we are now in the 21st century. Scholars such as George Landau, Alan Raniere, and Jay Bolter tell us that we must turn our attention now to hypertext, to that media that helps electronically link words and images that are just a click away. For my purposes, I think hypertext does represent something brand new, something that is rich and original, not only a way to gain information, but a way to help us understand more about the culture in which we live, a way to help us understand more fully and richly the ways that communication might be presented. I think the World Wide Web and what it stands for truly is something new in discourse. So, what are our uses of rhetorical theory? Why have we gone through this lecture? First of all, I want you to realize that literacy has psychodynamic properties, that literacy is an important way of constructing our consciousness, and that we have to understand as much as we can about the relationships between literacy and orality. Epistemology simply means the way we come to know things, and for our purposes, the idea of invention and the idea of rhetoric or style have to be intertwined from the very beginning. Look, you'll come up with an idea, you'll write down the idea, you'll read it, and you'll realize this is not what I wanted to say at all, and you'll revise the idea. As well, in proposal writing, as you begin to write the idea and try it out on others, pre-proposal stages, for example, with a funder, those ideas will be radically transformed. So writing becomes a way to know something. Logic, the idea of the syllogism, the enthymeme, in later lectures we'll talk about Toulmin's logic, becomes very important. Also the idea of indeterminacy. In proposal writing, we want to understand that there is a great chance that we'll be misunderstood. And we want to try to capitalize on the ways that we might be misunderstood to limit and refine our writing so that we can be as sure as we possibly can that as difficult as it is, we can convey our meaning precisely. Audiences are multiple, audiences are complex, and we need to spend some time thinking about the natures, desires, beliefs, attitudes, the things that our audiences hold dear, the things that agencies hold dear as funders, and how we might apply our ideas to their will to distribute their money in a philanthropic fashion. And finally, the idea of technology. NSF, for example, requires that many of its proposals be submitted electronically. Technology continues to shape and reshape our world, not only rhetorically, but in the world of proposal writing and proposal submission as well.